Hello and welcome to our first lecture for PBH435 Health Studies of Dangerous Drugs. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about some basic concepts that will support many of the discussions that we'll have throughout the semester. So one of the very first things that we need to discuss, we'll start with the fact that many of us here in the United States use drugs on a daily basis, and we don't consider it dangerous drug use or anything to be concerned about from a health perspective. Some of them are even what we use to support our health. So when we talk about substance use and drug use, let's start being clear that we're not always talking about a health risk. If we take a look at the slides on the screen here, the images on the left, this appears to be a healthy consumption pattern. We've got people in a social setting. We've got what seems to be a positive mood. Seems to be someone there who's choosing to consume another beverage, so no peer pressure in action. You compare that to the scenario on the right, and we can see how the same substance in two different settings can mean very, very different things. So what we're talking about is who's using the drug, how much they're using, and when, where, and why they're using. And we can see very different answers to those questions just in those two pictures below. And as you think through your own life and experiences, I'm sure you can think of some scenarios where that would apply as well. So next we're going to talk about 5 general principles of drug use, and these general principles are going to apply regardless of which drugs we discuss throughout the rest of the semester. And the first general principle, and an important one, is use is not abuse. If you think back to the pictures on the previous slide, we can point to one of those scenarios that seemed to be a use of the drug alcohol and one that seemed to be abuse of the drug alcohol. So even with the same substance, it's very common that we'll find patterns of use that are of health risk and patterns of use that are not. Second, every drug has multiple effects. We may look for one effect. We may be looking for only one of the ways that the drug will affect our body, but the reality is that every drug is going to affect other sites in our brain, other organs and organ systems in our body, and there's no drug that we know of that just has a single effect on a single brain site or organ system. Another important principle, amount matters. Doses that are larger, doses that are more frequent, or doses that cause, or consumption methods that cause a faster onset of the drug's effects. All of these can produce different effects than drugs at smaller, less frequent, or slower consumption methods. Our fourth general principle, our own personal history and expectations affect the drug-related effects that we'll experience. We can see this in the concept of tolerance, that an experienced user is going to feel differently after consuming a drug than an inexperienced user, and even our expectations, the things that we believe will happen after we consume alcohol or consume any drug, make those effects more and less likely to occur. When we get to alcohol, we'll see some interesting work that's been done with that. And then finally, drugs themselves, drugs are not good or bad. Drugs are inert chemicals sitting on a shelf. Now, they definitely can cause negative or sometimes positive effects in our lives, but the drugs themselves, these are simply chemicals, and if we try to attribute good or bad to these substances, then we're ignoring all the factors that contribute to a healthy or unhealthy relationship or experience after consuming the drug. So these 5 basic principles, these are going to support all of the conversations that we'll have about drug use and abuse throughout the semester. So next we're going to define some important terms, and we're going to start with that very first one, drug. So this is a really, really broad category. We need something that covers everything from ibuprofen to nicotine, caffeine to heroin. And this is the definition we'll use for that broad category. Any substance, natural or artificial, other than food, that by its chemical nature alters structure or function in a living organism. So you can think about, if we took out that other than food phrase, we can think of foods like sugars that would really fit that definition. So that's why we include that other than food to exclude those and keep this category focused on the substances that we'll be discussing this semester. Next, an illicit drug. Now these are really easy to categorize. These are drugs that are illegal to possess or use. So some drugs, say like alcohol, They can be illicit at a certain age and then legal at another age. So we'll talk a little bit about that, actually quite a bit about that later in the semester. The next category gets a little bit more complicated, and that's deviant drug use. So deviant drug use is actually defined by social norms. We're talking about drug use that isn't common or is looked down upon within a certain social group. And I'd be willing to bet that in our class here, we have people who come from families where any consumption of alcohol is considered deviant, and then people who come from other families where alcohol consumption is considered well within the bounds of their social norms. So deviant drug use can be difficult to define. We also have drugs like peyote that have been used in some Native American rituals for millennia that have now become illicit based on current law here in the United States. But even that law can be subject for interpretation. Recent Supreme Court decisions have categorized peyote as legal for ceremonial uses, but not for recreational. So the same drug, the same person, and even different circumstances can change that category from legal to illicit. And then finally, drug misuse. And here we're talking about use of those drugs in different amounts or for different purposes than for their original purposes. Than their original intent. So continuing to define our important terms, now we're going to move on to drug abuse. The definition we'll use here is use of a substance in a manner, an amount, or in situations that cause social, occupational, psychological, or physical problems. So this gets broad. It can mean different things for different people, but in general, we're talking about a use that is problematic. So when the use of the drug begins to cause problems. And then finally, drug dependence. So note that we're not using the term addiction here. Addiction is a term that's come to be very widely used in our society. We talk about people being addicted to their phones, addicted to chapstick, and we're really talking about something very different when we're talking about drugs. So we're going to talk about drug dependence here in class. And this is that state in which an individual uses a drug so frequently or consistently that it would be difficult for the person to stop. So it's important to note that this may not be physiological. It may be the person may have a physical dependence on the drug, but it may actually be psychological dependence as well. And when we look at all of the symptoms that go with that condition of drug dependence, we define it as a behavioral disorder. So note that we don't have a definition here for dangerous. And basically that's because all drugs, whether they're prescription, whether they're illicit, or whether they're over the counter, can be dangerous to some of us. Tylenol can damage your liver under certain conditions. You could have an allergic reaction to a prescription that your doctor has recommended for you. We know that there's a strong relationship between nicotine consumption and lung cancer, and then some non-physiological reactions. We know that alcohol consumption can be linked to personal safety concerns. So all drugs can be used in a manner that is dangerous. So we tend to think of drug abuse in the United States here in the 21st century and before us in the 20th as a uniquely modern American situation and problem. But the reality is that drug use is pretty much as old as recorded history. Throughout history, we have seen drugs being used for enhancing spiritual experiences, for treatment for illnesses, and we've seen some major economic roles for opium trading routes and that kind of thing for drug use as well. Some changes here in the modern period, we've seen the rise of legal drugs, of the prescriptions and pharmaceuticals that we take for a variety of purposes, and then also this thing that we call the war on drugs, the legal efforts to prosecute drug use and drug users. So just a couple of visuals on that history of drug use. This is actually a depiction of drug use from an Aztec civilization in the 13th century. You can see that the figures in the picture are clearly enjoying something that they're smoking. It seems to be kind of a relaxing nature. So we don't know exactly what it was, but we know that whatever it was that they were consuming is something that we would now today consider a drug. And this is actually a depiction of drug use in the Egyptian pyramid, so even earlier. And actually, when mummies have been analyzed for chemical traces, there are reports of traces of cocaine, hashish, and even nicotine in mummies. So clearly not a modern American problem. Of course, we will be talking here in class about drug use here in the 21st century United States. And one of the first questions that we usually want to answer is how many of us are using them? And the answer to this is pretty complicated. It turns out that it's not very easy to get good, solid information on how many people use drugs. If they are using drugs, which ones are they, which ones, and how much. Especially when those drugs are illicit, people tend to be unwilling to talk about behaviors that are considered against the law. And even drugs that are considered legal, such as alcohol and tobacco, because there may be social stigma against their use, people do not necessarily tend to be honest when they report when and how often and how much they're using drugs. So we do, of course, need to collect some information somehow so we know where we're starting from. And we do use a couple of different survey questionnaires to get information on drug use here in the United States. Some of the benefits from surveys are that they're very easy to conduct. We send them out, we get them back. They're not typically very time consuming for the people who are filling them out, and we tend to be able to reach a broad group of users. But we do have some limitations. We tend to be very interested in drug use among young people. We tend to administer those surveys in schools. So basically, if we've got people who've dropped out of school, it's very difficult to reach them through these school-based surveys. And of course, students who drop out may be at risk for higher levels of drug use than students who remain in school. And then we've also got the potential for people to self-report behavior that's a little different than they actually engage in real life. So we do have, especially when we do surveys among teenagers, we see two different trends. We see students who decide to sound a little bit more of course, we do have questions about what drug use does look like here in the 21st century United States. So we try to conduct surveys and collect data on who's using what and when and how much. It turns out, though, that this is a pretty difficult question to answer. It's not easy to find out how many people are using, and it can be especially difficult when we're talking about illegal drugs. And even when we're talking about legal drugs, where there may be social stigma against consumption, such as tobacco or excessive alcohol use, people tend not to be entirely honest with us when we ask our questions about their habits. We do send out those surveys pretty regularly, though. They're awfully easy to use, and they tend to be pretty inexpensive and easy to reach a broad population with. We do see some drawbacks, though, when we try to use surveys. Is particularly among younger populations. So first of all, if we're trying to reach student populations, we tend to do those surveys in a school setting. Now, when we do that, we're automatically missing any students who may have dropped out. And those, of course, tend to be young people who are at higher rates or higher risk for high rates of drug use than students who have remained in school. And then we also have the problem of inaccurate self-reports. People tend to lie when we ask them about their drug use patterns, and we can't even predict which way they do lie. Some people exaggerate and some people minimize. And it can depend a lot on the setting in which the survey is conducted and who they expect are going to be able to see the results. So we conduct these surveys pretty regularly because of their ease of use and their inexpensive nature, but we don't always know how accurate the data we're getting will actually be. So when we talk about who uses drugs, we're talking about really, really broad categories of people. It's a wide range of rates and amounts. And even within a particular substance using population, we may see really, really broad ranges of patterns of usage, regardless of what kind of drug that we're talking about. Of course, when we're trying to talk about prevention efforts or treatment efforts, the range of people that we may be addressing has a very important role. We do know that the more accurately our prevention and treatment efforts are focused on a target population, the more likely we are to be successful. So if we're trying to categorize a range of users for a prevention program, the fact that we're talking about many, many different kinds and ages of people can be very complicated. And also, when we talk about efforts to enforce drug laws and to treat drug dependence, this can be complicated as well. Now, we do continue to try and collect this information. One of our most important surveys is the Monitoring the Future project. Some of you may actually have taken this survey in high school. It's conducted in 8th through 12th grade classrooms and in college, and we've been collecting this data every year for almost 40 years. And what we're basically looking for here is prevalence, how many people are using, and then also perceived risk and availability. So you've got some data here from Monitoring the Future to take a look at. And what we're going to see is that it starts to show some trends over time. So if we take a look at this slide, we're looking at perceived availability of marijuana on that top blue line. So if we look at the data from 1976 to 2012, we really don't see much change in that perceived availability. What we do see are some pretty broad swings in perceptions of risk and the number of users. So if we look at that time period around between 1990 and 1992, we see that the perceived risk of marijuana use has risen pretty steeply, and that the actual reported rate of use has dropped in a corresponding fashion. And then as we move into the 21st century, we see those lines kind of returning and merging together to the point where perceived risk of marijuana use is at its lowest point since 1978, when use was much more widespread. So this is the kind of data that we collect in the Monitoring the Future study, and it can give us some really important information on drug use over time. Another major drug study conducted here in the United States is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or the NSDUH. So this isn't just based on students. It's actually it's data that's gathered from households all over the United States, and it's done in face-to-face interviews. So there's some level of complication here. We may find that people tend to be more honest about illicit behaviors, whether they're sexual or drug-related, in an anonymous setting. So if we have somebody sitting face-to-face with you and asking about your drug use, you may be less honest than you would be if you considered that setting more anonymous. We do start with folks age 12 and above, so we don't really collect data on anybody much younger than that. And again, this one's been collected annually for almost the same period of time. For the NSDUH, what we're asking about is, again, the prevalence of drug use, but also the frequency. And again, because it's been collected for such a long time, we're able to look at trends over time. So here's some data from the NSDUH, and we're looking at percentage of users who reported marijuana use in the previous month. We can actually see how those lines are relatively parallel, even though we're talking about two different age groups and two different rates of prevalence. The patterns are pretty similar. And if we went back to the Monitoring the Future study over the same period of time, we're going to see a really similar pattern there as well. Let's take a look at another set of data from the NSDUH. And this is actually comparing alcohol use, marijuana, and cocaine use. So alcohol in that lightest purple, we can see it's definitely the most broadly used drug among the young adults responding to the survey, so ages 18 to 25. And it never really dips much below about 55% in about 2000, about 55% of the respondents reporting alcohol use in the last 30 days. We see that trend with marijuana use that we saw in the previous study, that spike in the late 70s, and then the decline, and then rising back up again more towards the 2012 data at the end. And then that bright pink there, that would be cocaine use, and we see that peak in the 80s, and then a drop off to a fairly low rate that continues through the 2012 data at the end. So it's reassuring for us as researchers to see those rates are similar. if we look at the data from the two surveys and we put them together and we see that the data reported is similar, it gives us more confidence in the fact that we're getting accurate information from both surveys. So when we combine the data from the two and see those similar patterns, we're seeing an indication that what we're getting is real data, that these trends are real, and that they're reflecting actually changes in American society over that time period. Think about the 70s, you may have some perceptions of drug use there. Think about the 80s, you may have some different perceptions, possibly involving less marijuana and more cocaine. And then into the 21st century here, where we're seeing legalized not just medical use, but actually recreational use of marijuana here in the United States. And you can see how those are actually supported by the data. All right, so now we're going to move on to some correlates of drug use. So what are correlates? These are variables that are statistically related to other variables, such as probably our variable of interest here, which would be drug use. Now, it's really important to realize that just because two behaviors happen at the same time or two conditions exist at the same time, it does not mean that one condition causes the other. So correlates are not causes. And a really classic example of this is the fact that neighborhoods with high rates of crime tend to have the highest number of churches. So if we think about why that might be, we might think that the crime rate is causing the churches. The people there live in dangerous circumstances and they're more likely to express their faith in a community setting. Or we might think that the churches are causing the crime. But the reality is that these two statistics are both correlated with high population density. So the more people you have living in an area, the more churches you have. The more people you have living in an area, the more crime you have. And even though high church density and high crime rates are correlated, one does not actually cause the other. So when we talk about a correlate, we're not talking about one thing that causes another or one variable that's in a relationship of causation. We're just talking about things that co-occur. So when we talk about risk factors for adolescent drug use or correlates of drug use in teenagers, two of our most important risk factors are having friends who use drugs and then also engaging in antisocial activities. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We also have protective factors, though, so correlates of not using drugs. And these include perceptions of strong sanctions against use, so that social norm in your community, it's not that your friends use drugs, but the perception that there's a strong sanction against that use, that it's really frowned upon and discouraged. And then also being able to rely on your parents as a social support. Both of those are considered protective factors, and they're correlated with not using drugs in adolescence. So some more correlates and expanding out beyond the adolescent population. Gender, we definitely see that men use more drugs than women. Race and ethnicity. And this is not a straightforward correspondence where we can just say that this particular racial or ethnic group is more likely to consume drugs than other people. These patterns actually vary very, very widely depending on which drug we're talking about. For instance, we know that whites are much more likely to consume alcohol than African Americans. So depending on the drug and the population, we may see different patterns. Level of education, like many other things, people who have with higher levels of education are less likely to be drug users. We use tobacco as our example here. People who graduate from college are less likely to smoke tobacco than people who've completed high school. We also have personality variables such as impulsivity, and then also genetics. We know that genetics has a role to play in who is going to develop a dependency on a particular substance. So we're not looking at a single gene when we talk about genetics. You do not have an addiction gene. And it's also not a guarantee or a destiny that you're definitely going to become dependent on a substance. It may be linked to the speed at which you become dependent. People may be genetically more susceptible to dependence, or it may be linked to the severity of your withdrawal symptoms if you stop using the drug. If we look at studies of identical twins, and these are interesting because these people have the exact same genetic material, we've been able to determine that about half of your risk for drug dependence is actually dependent. So not 100%, but about 50%. So it can make you more disposed, but it's definitely not a guarantee. So we talked about correlates, or things that happen at the same time as drug use. Now we're going to talk about antecedents. So these are factors that occur before an event. And they're not necessarily causes either. They're kind of like correlates that occur before the drug use is noted. So when we talk about antecedents, we're talking mostly about behavioral factors that we've noted. This includes aggressiveness, conduct problems, poor school performance, attachment to a drug-using peer group, and then also parental and community norms that support that use of drugs. So when we start to think about why this might be happening, why aggressive kids might be more likely to become drug users, we think that these are signs of other personality factors or influences. Maybe an indicator of your future peer group, because we know that peer group has a strong role to play, and perhaps a stronger desire to alter reality. When we go back to the human history of drug use, that's what we keep coming back to. No matter what the society, no matter what the drug, people consume substances because of that basic desire to alter their reality. And if you think about the child that we're describing, a child with aggressive behaviors, a child with conduct problems, poor academic performance, these are probably students that are more likely to want to alter their reality than students who have a more positive or successful environment. So a couple of other terms that you may have heard related to drug use include gateway substances. So this came into popular use, and the perception is that a gateway drug is one of the first drugs that a typical drug user will encounter. And alcohol and tobacco are usually the ones that are considered most likely here. We don't really see a strong statistical relationship between the use of alcohol or tobacco and progression to other kinds or more dangerous kinds of drugs. And if we think about what that really means, what that gateway substance use might be representative of, it may be a stronger desire to alter reality, or maybe an early indicator of that basic pattern of behavior that departs from social norms. And it results from some of those risk factors and the absence of the protective factors that we talked about earlier. So we don't really have data to support that idea of gateway drug use, that children who start, or teenagers who start using alcohol and tobacco are likely to become users of more dangerous drugs later in life. So that whole concept of gateway drugs is not necessarily something that's supported by the science. Okay, so finally, our last general topic that we'll cover in this lecture: motives for drug use. Why are people consuming these substances to alter reality? And we've identified several influences when we've investigated motives for drug use. Definitely identification with some kind of deviant subculture. We talk about deviance, that's a departure from social norms. So, an identification with some kind of subculture that departs from social norms in your community, a trend toward rebelliousness, and then also reinforcing properties of the drugs. So, if you are interested in altering your reality because it's difficult for you to deal with, the drug makes it easier for you to deal with that reality. It's then reinforced that influence that was driving you towards drug use in the beginning. And then finally, that human desire to experience an altered state that has existed throughout human history. One of the reasons why drug use is not new and has actually been recorded for as long as people have been recording their history, that desire to alter reality. So when we start to think about influences on drug use, those correlates, the antecedents, the risk factors, the protective factors, it can be useful to think about them in this kind of the format that's presented in this slide. So we have some of those individual factors like personality, genetics, your knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, your biology, whether you have that genetic risk for drug dependence or not. We've got individual factors, but we also have community and family factors. How does your community perceive drug use? Is it considered deviant in your family group, in your school group, in your church group? We've got the role of church and religious influences. We've got the influence of gangs. So lots of ways that the community and the family around you can influence your drug use as well. And then finally, societal. And we saw those trends in the Monitoring the Future and NISDA data. We saw a response to the permissiveness of the 70s, the just say no period in the 80s, those kinds of societal influences. The availability, the cost, the potential cost of laws and legal penalties, advertising, many different societal influences that can influence drug use as well. So that'll wrap us up for Chapter 1 here. I hope you've been completing your study guide as we've gone along. Remember that those are an excellent preparation for your exams, and I will be back with lecture for Chapter 2.